Welcome to the 2021 Watershed Congress. This is Wednesday, September 22nd, day 3 of our virtual Watershed Congress week. We're happy that you're joining us again today. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in collaboration with many other organizations. My name is Sherry Town. I'm Director of Grants and Operations with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'm also your moderator for today's session, The Promise of Anti-Degradation, Case Studies from Across the Watershed. We're pleased to present this topic today. Our speakers for this session are Doug O'Malley, Director of Environment New Jersey, Abby Jones, Vice President of Legal and Policy at Penn Future, and Dr. Eric Sildorf, Restoration Director and Senior Scientist at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker tonight, Doug O'Malley. Doug, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to the whole Delaware Riverkeeper Network team. And everyone who's helping to make this Congress possible. Obviously, thank you to all the sponsors of the Watershed Congress, right? That list of organizations is broad and expansive. And also just to thank you to all of you. I think we're going to have a really kind of tight crew here. I know some of you, I recognize some of the names in the list. So great to see Colleen from the River Network and Chris Miller from the Eastern Environmental Law Clinic. I'm sure there are others that are very familiar with anti-degradation. Our goal for this presentation is to kind of do a little bit of everything. We want to kind of go over the basics. We want to talk about kind of where anti-degradation comes from. We want to talk about how it actually works on the ground. And we're going to have a very parochial focus in this case on both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then we're going to dive into some direct case studies on the Cooper River and the South Branch of the Raritan in New Jersey, and then the Swiftwater Creek and the Tohickon in Pennsylvania. And those case studies, I think, are going to tell us, just a little bit more on what works and sometimes the challenges of implementing anti-degradation protections as well. And then we obviously want to hear, and then we obviously want to talk about how to take action, how to use these protections. And we definitely want to hear from you. So I want to start off just by asking everyone to put in the chat their full name, if you feel comfortable, where you're from. If you are affiliated with the organization, please do that, just so we have a better sense of kind of where the audience is. And then also note too, there's both the Q&A and the chat, right? So certainly feel free to enter in the chat thoughts as you're listening to myself or Eric or Abby talk. The Q&A, definitely don't save that to the end, right? Put in questions directly to the Q&A because we do want to kind of offer kind of a robust opportunity to have more of a dialogue at the end of the presentation, especially on particular case studies. So, just as a heads up, we will ask you if you have case studies that you want to reference and that we can kind of talk about in conjunction with the case studies we prepared. So, that's a long lead up, but I'm thrilled that we're all here. And we'll let me kind of kick it off by turning it over to Abby.
Thanks, Doug. So I'm just going to spend just a few minutes doing a very high level, what is anti-degradation, just to kind of set us up for basically the case studies and the discussion at the end. So when we look at the water quality standards under the Clean Water Act and under our state regulations, there are 3 basic building blocks of water protections. The designated uses, which are the uses that are on the books. And these are things like aquatic life uses, water supply, recreation. Then we have water quality criteria, which are the standards that are used to protect the use. And then we have what we're here to talk about today, the anti-degradation protections. And this goes to the Clean Water Act's national goal to protect and maintain the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of our nation's waters. So once we've already achieved a use, we're going to make sure that we protect that going forward. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about uses, every stream should have a designated use and an existing use. And this is going to matter when we start talking about later how to put anti-degradation into action to protect our streams. So designated uses, as I mentioned, are the ones that are on the books. These are the uses that a state assigns to a water body, whether or not it has been attained. And this is sometimes thought as clean water goals for a stream. And these are listed in the state water quality standards. So you can go to your regulations, you can see what a stream or stream segment is designated as. The existing use, on the other hand, are those uses that are actually attained in your water body or water body segment after 1975, whether or not that is included in the state's water quality standards. And as we'll get into a little bit later, you can have differing existing uses and designated uses. Next slide. And so when we look at anti-degradation, remember, once the existing use is obtained, we need to protect that. So that's your tier 1 in the 3 tiers of anti-degradation. And these tiers are set up under the Federal Clean Water Act, but each state, as Doug and Eric will explain in just a little bit, implements these tiers in different ways. So tier 1 is that basic, like, true anti-degradation. We are not going to allow degradation once a higher existing use has been achieved. We're going to make sure that at the very minimum, we are protecting that. The tier 2 is then the protection of higher quality waters. And each state, again, has different names for these higher quality waters, but these waters are kind of better than necessary. And then we have our tier 3, and this is the highest tier with the best anti-degradation protections. And these are outstanding national resource waters, which have unique characteristics that need to be preserved. Next slide. So how does anti-degradation work in Pennsylvania and New Jersey? I'm going to turn it over to Doug now to talk about New Jersey, and then Eric will follow talking about Pennsylvania.
Super. Thank you. Thank you so much, Abby. So I want to just do a very kind of brief definition of kind of how we implement anti-degradation protections in New Jersey. Then we'll get into just a little bit more on what those protections look like on the ground. So as Abby was discussing, right, there's essentially 3 tiers of these protections. For New Jersey, the highest level of protection is the outstanding national resource waters, or ONRW. We traditionally find those they're the highest quality waters. They're usually found on public lands. They're preserved in their pristine state. You can't really, you're kind of either an outstanding national resource water or you're not. And we're obviously very grateful for this protection because it ensures that our waters, especially on our federal lands, are protected to the highest possible standards. Category 1 and Category 2, that's kind of everything else. Category 1 is the protection that we've spent now close to 2 decades working to use in a more discrete way to be able to protect more of the original definition of the surface water quality standards from 35 years ago, which was not just trout streams, which was essentially the way the program was being implemented in many ways for its first 15 years. We want Category 1 based on the surface water quality designations, refers to water supply, ecological and recreational values, as well as shellfish. And Category 2 is essentially everything else. So there's a broad set of waters in the state, and honestly, more of them probably should be Category 1. And we've seen a measurable increase over the course of the last 2 decades on that effort to get increased protections for more of the state's waterways. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is what I was referencing. And I want to focus on kind of the areas that are defined in the surface water quality standards, but it wasn't really until 2003 that there was kind of more definition behind this. The surface water quality standards also refer to trout maintenance and trout production. So trout production, obviously very important, especially for the anglers amongst us. That is one of the ways that waterways have been upgraded, as well as referencing before, areas with exceptional shellfish significance. That being said, those are pretty discrete categories of protections. The exceptional water supply, ecological and recreational significance obviously are much broader. And the DEP, this is again more than 15 years ago, outlined exactly what counts as the water supply. And their definition, which is still used to this day, is water bodies that provide drinking water for more than 100,000 people. Ecological significance is even kind of more well defined. It includes aquatic threatened and endangered species, as well as aquatic dependent threatened and endangered species. And then it also uses a matrix of essentially 4 criteria that if you, it's a little bit like, playing a, ecological version of tic-tac-toe. If you qualify for 2 of the 4, you win. And that matrix includes percentage of impervious cover, which is one of obviously an important significant important signal for water quality. Although I think we can argue it's incredibly stringent. It also includes a fish biological index, as well as criteria for macroinvertebrates, which those of us that kind of get our hands dirty, and Eric certainly is familiar with this. Those are the good bugs, right? You want to find those good bugs out there, because that is usually a sign of a very healthy stream. And so those, that criteria is very well defined. So if you're, and this kind of makes, in many ways, makes things harder for the department, because they have to clearly outline the existing aquatic species and water quality for upgrades. And we have actually seen some waterways, even in the most, especially in the most recent version, that because some of the water testing data was a little antiquated, those upgrades had to be taken down because of decreasing water quality and macroinvertebrate testing that occurred. So that's exceptional ecological significance. And then in many ways, I have this listed here as exceptional recreational significance. I'd like to be able to say there's more of a definition there, and there is not. And that's a kind of an outstanding concern from the broader conservation community, because this means that if you're a wild and scenic river, right, you are not afforded protection based on the recreational significance that designation means. And so this is an issue. If you go back and look at stakeholder notes from the department, we've raised this for years. We are continuing to raise it. It's an issue that we think we actually can define what is considered to be exceptional recreational significance, and that can help us to capture a whole other set of waterways and uses of waterways that are not there yet. One additional thing here too on water supply significance, that cutoff of 100,000 people, obviously that works if you're above 100,000. But if you're below that cutoff, it obviously seems arbitrary, because it is. And so that's another issue of being able to expand kind of the reach of Category 1, and to be able to look at the intent in the initial surface water quality language from 1985. We're still working to achieve, I think, the most maximum level of waterways that can qualify. And then I kind of skipped over this, and this is hugely important. Why does this matter? Why is this so important? And from the Category 1 level, right, and this is a point I don't want to kind of gloss over. It's a lot easier to protect a waterway before there's a threat of degradation. It's certainly a lot easier to protect a waterway than to have to remediate past pollutant harm. And I think all of us intuitively know that. But when we're kind of looking at the kind of best use of our kind of advocacy on a local, regional, and state levels, I personally think that anti-degradation is the kind of strongest tool that we can use, because once it's protected, it provides a backstop to be able to prevent future degradation. Doesn't mean it always will, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But the reason why New Jersey protections are so important, again, in the definition of the surface water quality standards, no measurable degradation of water quality, which is hugely important if you're looking to have a sewage discharge pipe. And then also the 300-foot buffer zone around both sides of the waterway. Easiest way to think of this is two big football fields on both sides of a Category 1 waterway. That buffer is designed to obviously restrict that degradation, restrict runoff pollution. That's hugely important and a key reason why C1 protections are such a big deal. So let's keep going. Let me turn it over to my Pennsylvania colleagues.
And so, excuse me. Hi, everyone. Eric Solder from the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'm going to just briefly touch on some of the similarities and differences over on the Pennsylvania side. And a lot of folks that are in the meeting today know some of this. So I'll touch on it briefly. If you have questions, again, encourage you to throw questions in the Q&A or the chat. Pennsylvania has some similarities and some differences to New Jersey. It has 2 levels of special protection rather than that main category 1 that leads to no measurable change and keeping clean waters clean. Pennsylvania has an intermediate level and then a more stringent level. The intermediate level is called high quality waters, HQ waters, and the more stringent, where there are fewer exceptions, fewer loopholes, is the exceptional value waters, the EV waters. So our HQ and EV streams in Pennsylvania are our main types of anti-degradation. There always is the possibility of ONRW, those federal and most stringent, but generally that is not something that we see, and we don't see new additions to the ONRW waters. We primarily are dealing with HQ and EV waters when we're talking about adding anti-degradation protections or implementing anti-degradation protections in Pennsylvania. The way that an individual stream or a watershed would qualify for either being HQ or VEV is traditionally through biological measures, similar to what Doug was describing in New Jersey, using the macroinvertebrates, the diversity and the health of the macroinvertebrate community to say, hey, do we really have something that's extraordinary here? And does it look like a reference stream, something that has been largely unimpaired or untouched by human impacts? And to get to HQ waters, you have to score in the 80s, and to get to an exceptional value waters, you almost have to get a perfect score compared to a reference stream. You have to get above 90 to get an EV designation. And so it's pretty stringent. It's pretty hard to actually maintain that. You have to have, almost perfect bug scores in order to get those HQ or EV. So stringent, and it's a way of Pennsylvania implementing their anti-degradation that says, yeah, we're gonna really pick the best of our best streams. There are in the Pennsylvania regulations other pathways to getting to HQ or EV. The one that is most often seen outside of the macroinvertebrates, the biological, is another biological, and it's similar to the category 1 in New Jersey, where trout streams, particularly the most productive trout streams with the highest biomass, the Class A trout streams, are automatically given HQ status in Pennsylvania. So a big, strong qualifier. There's a few weird caveats, and we can go into that in the Q&A if people want to discuss that. But usually that's an automatic HQ qualifier if you have high biomass of naturally reproducing trout streams. And then there's the chemical and soft qualifiers, where if you're in certain protected areas, if you have outstanding recreational or ecological significance, and typically those are less frequently used. We did see in the upper Lehigh watershed, the protections primarily through state-owned lands playing a really important role, because the macroinvertebrates, the bugs, didn't look fantastic up above F.E. Walter Reservoir, but nevertheless, the protections afforded by state lands led the state DEP to say, yeah, these waters and a really huge section of a bunch of different streams, a big watershed area, qualified as an EV upgrade. And so then what does an anti-degradation designation mean in Pennsylvania? The biggest and most important implication of having either an HQ or an EV is through the permitting process for point source discharges. Again, the idea with anti-degradation is we keep clean waters clean. Their water quality is already above what standards would require. And so instead of letting them fall and letting them just kind of float down to just your average stream, we're going to try to keep those streams really clean. And with HQ streams, the protections are strong, but there is a social and economic justification that if you can provide a social or economic justification, you can wiggle out of some of the requirements to keep the water quality exactly where it is at before you go in with that new point source facility. Whereas with EV streams, this is why EV is stronger, there are no exceptions. There are no social or economic justifications that allow wiggle room and allow water quality degradation to be permitted. And then again, similarly, but not quite as strong as in New Jersey, there are buffer requirements. Riparian buffers are, of course, immensely important for protecting the health and the ecological integrity, the habitat of our streams and rivers. And over in Pennsylvania here, we have a 100-foot riparian buffer requirement for HQ and EV streams. Again, HQ, it is easier to wiggle out of that requirement. EV, it's harder. But certainly we are a little envious in Pennsylvania of the very strict requirements and implementation of those requirements in New Jersey, where that 300-foot buffer is a major factor in decision-making at all levels of government, and really provides pretty stringent enforcement for new activities in a watershed. Again, dischargers seeking permits, again, the point source side of things, need to consider non-discharge alternatives. And again, only for HQ streams are you allowed to think about degradation of the water quality and using some of these best available combination, basically BMPs, to minimize the impacts there. So again, there are buffer requirements in Pennsylvania. They're not as strong as New Jersey. In Pennsylvania, we think of the HQ and EV protections primarily as affording us benefits when it comes to permitting and requiring that point source discharges do not degrade the water quality and ecological integrity of these streams. Okay, this is where I think it gets more fun. Instead of just talking about regulations and rules, we have a series of case studies, 2 in Pennsylvania and 2 in New Jersey, that aren't necessarily even just traditional case studies of like, okay, here's a great stream with good bugs. This is how the process and this is how it goes. These are a little bit different. They kind of beat to a slightly different drum and are out of the norm, but illustrate the power of the anti-degradation process and how we can continue to push and protect more streams. And before we launch in on these case studies, one thing that we want to encourage everyone to do is to also add your own ideas and examples into the chat or into the Q&A. I think Abby and Doug and I are familiar with a number of the anti-degradation petitions that have gone on in both states. And we'd be happy to talk a little bit more about how our own case studies interface and are similar to and different than the other case studies that people are familiar with, or the challenges that you have faced in getting anti-degradation protections in your stream. So again, before we launch into those case studies, encourage folks to throw ideas or questions into the chat and Q&A as we launch into this. But we will dive in by first looking at perhaps the strangest of the anti-degradation protections, one of the strangest that I know of. We are walking into the urban area around Philadelphia and Camden. We are on an urban river in Camden, New Jersey. And you can see that this is, even though it has a beautiful riparian corridor in this picture that I took from Upstream Alliance and a paddling event on the Cooper River, that water quality doesn't look like a pristine Pocono stream or a Catskill stream or a North Jersey stream. This is a tidal river right in the Philly-Camden region, horribly degraded 50 years ago, a lack of oxygen, toxics, all kinds of problems, but a stream for which the water quality has improved measurably and significantly over the last 50 years with the implementation of regulations at DRBC, at the state level, and across the state in Pennsylvania. And it is a highly turbid river. It's a tidal system with about a 5 to 6 foot tidal range on average. And so really high energy. That's part of the reason that you see that turbid coloration of the water that the Delaware, tidal Delaware River and the tidal Cooper River have, as far as we know it, always been turbid systems that are well mixed and high energy. And so it's not that this stream is pristine, which is, again, oftentimes what has been used as the requirement to get to an anti-degradation protection. But in this case, it is the fact that there is unique ecology in this system. And the state recognizes that, yeah, even where you don't have a pristine system, if you have unique species or species of conservation concern, we have to hold the line. We have to protect those systems. And so again, an unusual situation, not your standard type of high mountain, 100% forested watershed in terms of getting anti-degradation protection. This was proposed in 2019 and it was approved in 2020 to get that C1 degradation in New Jersey. The key factor, the key thing that led to exceptional ecological significance for the Cooper River was the presence of robust populations of a number of freshwater mussel species, but in particular this T&E species called the eastern pond mussel. And folks like me who have been around a while know it as Lagumia nasuta, but in the last couple of years, they've changed the name on me, both the genus and the species, which makes it doubly difficult to remember it. So now a lot of folks are calling it Sagitunio nasutus rather than Lagumia nasuta. But anyway, the eastern pond mussel, really neat, amazing mussel with this really funky pointed posterior end. So really unique in terms of all the mussels, but a species for which there are very few populations in New Jersey. And so the state, recognizing this in 2019, said, yeah, we have to protect these streams. Even in an urban setting like Camden, we have to implement all of our tools in our toolkit to make sure that these populations that have come back over the last 50 years, again, there was no oxygen in this tidal section of river 50 years ago. Now that this mussel is back, we have to make sure that it stays here and continues to thrive in this. And so this is where the Category 1 protections are now being applied for the first time in New Jersey, and for the first time that I know of in our region, in an urban setting for the Cooper River. So really, really exciting to see this, and highlighting something that we would like to see expanded throughout the Delaware Basin, particularly in Pennsylvania, that has a robust anti-degradation program, but hasn't used T&E species traditionally as one of the qualifiers, and hasn't expanded and looked at holding the line in settings that aren't pristine and 100% forested. So this is something that we would like to see emulated in other settings. And then turn it over to Abby to talk about another great and much more pristine setting of Swiftwater Creek.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And that's exactly right. So we're going from urban to the headwaters, basically. This is Swiftwater Creek in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. This is a painting of the creek by the aquatic biologist that we know and love, Don Baylor, with Broadhead Watershed Association and Broadhead Trout Unlimited, among other groups. And so I think what's important here is that these streams, and these include Swiftwater, Tank, Devil's Hole, Paradise Creek, Cranberry Creek, and Tunkhannock Creek. These are creeks in Monroe County that have been historically, traditional, pristine Poconos waters, known for their trout fishing, known to bring people from all across the country to the Poconos for a century. And both Broadhead Watershed Association and Broadhead Trout Unlimited had petitioned our Pennsylvania DEP several years ago, in some cases 10 years ago, to make sure that these streams are protected as exceptional value streams. So that highest level protection to allow that there is no degradation of these streams. And what I want to talk to you today about is that it's these existing uses that these petitions are based on that really is giving these streams now protections. As I mentioned, these petitions have gone in a long time ago. The petition is to redesignate, so to change that designated use on the books. It takes us a little while to work through a convoluted regulatory process here in Pennsylvania. And so some of these streams have not quite had the designated use upgraded to match the higher existing use. And so when you have developers coming in who are looking to put a discharge in or to maybe get relief from some of those 100-foot, 50-foot buffers that Eric was talking about, it's important that we have watchdogs and we have people on the ground and we have our DEP looking at both of these uses. So in Swiftwater's case in particular, there were challenges both to how DEP actually identifies and classifies the existing use of the stream. And when that ultimately failed, the developer then challenged the designated use. And so you can see that these existing uses can carry through. And we'll talk a little bit later about why it's so important and how you, as watershed organizations and people who care about the streams, can utilize your partners, your municipalities to help protect the streams. But so here, these streams are still not out of the woods, so to speak. Pun intended, but rather to as Eric was talking about, these protections come in the permit. So what the courts said was you cannot challenge the existing use. You cannot challenge the designated use of a stream in Pennsylvania until there's actually a permit applied for, and that designated or existing use is applied through the permit, and the permittee can then claim injury. And so I think I just wanted to highlight very quickly, and I know Doug and Eric have other case studies they want to talk about, but I think it's important to know what the status of your stream is. And I also wanted to point out that the power behind coalition building when it comes to anti-degradation. Penn Future got involved on the legal front with our partners, Broadhead Watershed Association, but we also knew that we needed to get at the hearts and minds of the people in the Poconos. There's a lot of misinformation out there that, you know, strong clean streams protection will harm economic development, that those two things are mutually exclusive. And so we created the Our Pocono Waters campaign, which is an educational campaign, an outreach campaign that corrects that misinformation. And we've been working at educating our partners, educating our local and state legislators, educating businesses in support of this. And we're working on an economic study report that shows the true benefit of these anti-degradation tier 2 waters in Pennsylvania, special protection waters. So I'll stop there. Again, I encourage you all to include, thank you, Sherry, your own case studies or anything you want to talk about in the comments as we go through. I think with that, it goes over to Eric again.
You're still muted, Eric.
Thanks, Sherry. Another interesting example, but for one for which we don't have a great success yet on the books, is with the Tohickon Creek in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is a relatively large stream, 100 plus square mile drainage area. So you can see a really wide channel. And this stream has been altered by a number of things, right? Historically, the land use has been altered, although reforestation has occurred. But in particular, the state in the late 60s and early 70s built a dam on the Tohickon Creek to create Lake Nockamixon State Park. And that forever has altered the flow regime of the Tohickon Creek, the water quality, and the ecology of the system. And so this is a challenging one. It was first petitioned in 1995 for EV upgrade. And at every turn, the state of Pennsylvania said, no, doesn't quite meet our standards. Nope, doesn't fit in the box. Even though this is an extraordinary stream in so many ways, biological diversity, unique species, including some of those rare and endangered species like the eastern pond mussel we saw in the Cooper River, here with the plants and freshwater mussels that are present in the Tohickon Creek. Really extraordinary recreational opportunity, almost a complete corridor of preserved land along it, including state and county parks and local parks. So it qualifies with the spirit of the law, but to the letter, over and over, Pennsylvania has said, no, we've looked at the macroinvertebrates, we've looked at the fish, and it doesn't look like 100% forested cold water trout stream. And so because of that, you are falling short. And that's where it's a cautionary tale that it can be challenging to fit, particularly in Pennsylvania, within the strict limits of what the state will consider as an upgrade. And one of the things that, and there's a lot to highlight here, and I don't want to spend too much time, so happy to discuss this more if people have questions. Again, throw them in the chat, throw them in the Q&A. But one of the things that we have talked about in the past here at the Congress, and people have heard about, is the fact that the state continues to emphasize that only government-owned lands, government-protected lands, will help to qualify a stream for these HQ or EV protections. And we think that this is a really missed opportunity, that more and more, most of the land that is getting preserved is not getting preserved currently by government agencies. You don't see a lot of new state forests, state game lands, state parks. You do see, county and local municipal preservation, but even in Bucks County, that has really stalled in recent years. But nevertheless, local conservancies, the local land trusts, have preserved much of the corridor. Here is Lake Knockemixon at the upper end of the section that has been petitioned for EV status. And you can see the parcels of green, brown, and other colored lands. And you can actually see some of the colors in here of really extraordinary protections for this entire reach. But much of those will not be considered by the state because they are not government owned and controlled lands. And so this is a missed opportunity. We really think that this is an opportunity for the conservation community, for the land trust and conservancies to work together to help to elevate how important all of these preserved lands are in protecting our streams, and those deserve to not be washed away by missing an opportunity to upgrade to an HU or an EV status for these streams. So a lot to talk about with the Tohickon Creek, like with all of these streams, but that's one of the big points with the Tohickon. So let me throw it back over to Doug to talk about the last example in New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Eric and Abby. And I think, that example of the Tohickon, has parallels going across the river. Just as a personal note, my wife attended Tohickon Elementary School. So, near and dear to her heart and her family's heart. I want to talk about the latest or the last case study, which was a segment of the South Branch of the Raritan River. This segment you can see here in Flemington, which is upgraded to Category 1 last April. And the reason I want to focus on the South Branch of the Raritan is because it was certainly in the crosshairs for Hunterdon County and Hunterdon County freeholders. So much so that when the protection was announced at that point in March of 2019, that the freeholders were essentially up in arms because, next slide, right above the segment that was designated for an upgrade was this, the Raritan Township MUA. And this is often kind of what we see with protections, right, is that, and this Hunterdon County, I think, is the best example where they said, look, we were totally fine with 14 of these C1 upgrades. We did not like the 5 because those would have direct, in their words, direct economic impacts, right? And so it was kind of, a unique situation where the aggrieved party was just very open on what they thought, what they proposed as the deal, and their umbrage at having the DP essentially not listen to them in their minds, right? And they can continue to make an argument for kind of the economic value of being able to pollute water more, specifically to be able to expand the capacity of the Raritan Township MUA. Hunterdon County freeholders went so far to file litigation against DP for this. Next slide. So, this is kind of the case study that I kind of enjoy the most because, we often talk about Category 1 protections or anti-deg protections being, future protection, right? And in this case, that's still the case, right? It's not as if the MUA is going to disappear. It's still there. And that's not even to say that the MUA can't expand. It's just that they will have to use the best available technology not to have measurable degradation of that water quality. And, there's a very good, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole on this in the response to comments, and if I have a chance, I'll cite them. But there's a very good rationale for why the South Branch of the Raritan was upgraded. And I'm very thankful for the DP that this segment was not dropped. And the reason it comes back to the exceptional ecological significance, right? The DP had very good data on non-impaired aquatic life, on optimal stream habitat, and low impervious cover. And those, and by the way, you'll see in the link here, DP actually has a great mapping function now for Category 1 that's relatively new that they rolled out this spring, which is just kind of a great visualization of where C1 protections are, what gets upgraded to BC1, what are the qualifications. So please check that out. As I was running through here, though, the pushback, in some ways is almost philosophical, right? On kind of what is the best way to provide economic growth for a community, right? You'll see here, Matthew Holtz, which I don't think anyone, freeholder Holt, I don't think anyone confuses with an environmentalist. His argument is that the DP did not consider the economic impact DEP, of course, did not agree with that assessment. And they responded. I'm going to quote a little bit from the response to comments because I think this is kind of important both on the defense of DEP here, but also just how we frame development and redevelopment and kind of what that means for waterways. So DEP's response, and this is directly from the response to comments, essentially is that these protections provided are important not just to maintain water quality, but, quote, to safeguard public health and safety, ensure the availability of safe potable water supplies at a reasonable cost, and protect industrial and agricultural water supplies, recreation, tourism, fishing, and shellfish harvesting in the state, as well as the employment opportunities related to these industries. So this is a blanket defense. It wasn't directly related to the South Branch, but that gets at this broader issue of why we protect waterways and its value. There's obviously an intrinsic value. And then also this argument of what a protection means and what C1 means and doesn't mean. And the DP, again, was very strong on this. And again, this is from the response to comments, that the C1 anti-degradation designations, quote, do not prohibit positive water quality improvements. The no measurable change requirement applicable to new DP to new discharges requires no measurable negative change to the existing water quality, but does not prohibit improvements to existing water quality. I'm sure, obviously, the Raritan MUA wasn't, they're not thinking of improving water quality. They should, but again, the amendments to DP outline this. They do not preclude the construction of a new wastewater treatment facility. They do not preclude the possibility for redevelopment in existing pervious cover. That's obviously part of the reason that Camden was supportive of the Cooper River designation. And they also, the 300-foot buffer too is not, as much as we like to think that you can't touch it at all. There is some development that is allowed, but only so much that it doesn't actually degrade water quality. So I just want to kind of note here, there's a kind of definition of what is best for an economy. And ultimately, DP is not the Economic Development Authority. It is about protecting the environment. But there's also a very strong argument to say by doing that will actually help, the tourism economies of communities like Hunterdon County, which obviously have a huge opportunity there. So we're very thankful that DP had the back of the Clean Water Act and included these protections in the final adoption. The last thing to say here is that the last time there was a big fight over a waterway in Hunterdon County was way back in 2003 with the Sydney Brook. That was fought very heavily by a developer because they wanted to essentially do the same thing. They wanted to be able to discharge treated sewage directly into this very small brook, which connects to the South Branch of the Raritan. That was defeated for the same reason, which is, there was no way to circle the square. You cannot increase discharge into this water body without expected degradation. So let's continue here. That's the last of our case studies. Obviously, folks, feel free to put in additional thoughts in the chat, and let me turn it over to Abby to talk about anti-degradation in action.
Thanks, Doug. And I think I just want to reiterate the point that I think we've heard time and time again is that anti-degradation is key to keeping clean waters clean. But that does not mean that we cannot have development. It just has to be more thoughtful and more sustainable, right? We just can't put in a discharge point that's going to destroy the whole creek, but we have alternatives. And so I just want to be clear for everybody here, like having a tier 2 stream, having a class 1 water, having an EV stream doesn't mean you can't develop. It just means you have to be more thoughtful about it. And so that's why it's important to make sure that we are protecting the water quality uses. If you want to go to the next slide there. And it's because, as I started at the beginning here, appropriate water quality designations mean that permits and other regulations are ensuring that they're protected. And so we need watchdogging and enforcement. And I think Doug and Eric both talked about this, but there are many indirect benefits of tier 2 and 3 waters, including sustainable economy, cleaner streams and drinking water, which we just heard at New Jersey DEP cite to: ecotourism, healthier ecosystem diversity, right? We see that a lot up in the headwaters. Reduced water treatment costs, and smarter innovation in design planning. And that's something we need not only to protect our water, but to protect our air, to protect our communities. So you can see how all of these things come together. You want to go to the next slide? And so just, we touched on this quickly, so I'm just going to roll through this, but theoretically, permits shouldn't be granted if the discharge will lower water quality, but we've seen that there are some, even under anti-degradation, there are some situations where that can happen. So if you believe you have a stream that really exceeds and is really kind of a higher level, better than necessary special protection, it's important to make sure that we are letting our agencies know that the designated use and the existing use need to reflect that. And waterways with special protections have additional protections over just, you know, in our case, our cold water fisheries. Next slide. And so it's important that we make the designated uses match existing uses. And in many cases, you can petition to upgrade the designated use because these are simply regulatory changes. Finally, I just want to touch on how we all on this webinar, how we can support existing uses and tier 2 waters. One of the best ways is collect that data. Have community science. Have your community go out there, have them test the water quality, collect the data that would support an existing use. Even if your designated use isn't there, you can present evidence in a permit comment or a permit challenge if you're comfortable going there, we are, to show that the waters need that extra protection. Same thing, use that data to petition your state agencies to do redesignations. Land protections, riparian buffers. I know many of us work for land conservation organizations and really boots on the ground watershed organizations. Those are some of the best things you can do to support your tier 2 waters. It's also important, and I know this feels uncomfortable sometimes, but to do the community and municipal education and outreach. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your community, hear from them, and let them know just what we were talking about. You can have both. Having an EV stream running in your backyard is not going to prevent you from putting a shed or building a garage, right? So we want people to be comfortable with these clean streams and help us to protect them. And it's important also to know what's coming. Get in touch with your local zoning board, your local board of supervisors, attend the meetings, check the minutes, see what kind of development might be coming in and where it's located and how we can influence that. And then finally, another plug for OPW, but coalition building is really key, I think, in using anti-degradation to protect our best and most pristine waters. And with that, I think I'll turn it over for a discussion and some question and answers.
Thanks, everyone. We'll watch the Q&A in the chat for questions. And one of the questions that I had as we're sort of going through this, a lot of people sort of think as, you know, the Clean Water Act is, you know, 50 years, almost 50 years ago. A lot of the regulations to implement this, again, have been sometime in the past, as well as the programs to implement them. But Doug, you mentioned the, you know, the not having the definition for recreational significance. There was a reference to the role of preserved lands in Pennsylvania, and for some folks that may not be familiar, this effort that may be coming down to define what a conservation easement is. Doug and Abby, maybe you can speak a little bit to this opportunity that people really have to weigh in, and maybe, you know, they think of sort of these rules as the rules are set. The regulations have been passed a long time ago, but there's really sort of an ongoing conversation, and regulators are continuing to look at how these things are implemented and define what hasn't been defined or redefine what has been defined. How, if people want to make sure that they're weighing in on anti-degradation programs, how do people do that?
Yeah, Sherry, that's a really good question. And I'll just start by saying that we kind of touched upon what you can do for individual streams, ensuring that they are getting the best protections through existing uses and designated uses, and how you can petition your state agencies to redesignate the use that's on the books to make sure that those protections go in through permitting. So that's one way. Another way, and I'll kind of reference the issue in Pennsylvania that you brought up about whether conservation easements count in some of these softer qualifiers if they're owned by private entities versus governmental entities, whether they're held by them. And we've commented on this through the triennial review of the water quality standards for the state. So every 3 years under the Clean Water Act, the states need to reevaluate their water quality standards to ensure that they are being protective of the water quality that's actually out there. And so that's an excellent opportunity for all of us to get involved and make comments on any issue that it impacts water quality standards. If you think your stream is impaired, let them know. If you think that if you want to weigh in on that issue, that's an excellent opportunity. If you want to talk about designated uses or existing uses or something like that, the triennial review is a great opportunity to do that. And to the extent you're comfortable, you can always reach out to the regulators themselves and just have a conversation with them. They're really, for the most part, not as scary as you might think sometimes.
Yeah, so Cherry, that really is a great question, and I just have a kind of a couple thoughts on it. One, we haven't talked about it as much, and we certainly haven't used this tool as often in New Jersey, but you do have the ability through the Clean Water Act to petition the New Jersey DEP to upgrade particular water bodies, right? And that's kind of an inherent, one of the inherent great aspects of the Clean Water Act. From the DEP's perspective, you can't just send them a laundry list. I think the last time we used this tool was close to 15 years ago, and was a kind of a very extensive brief, essentially a petition for why, in this case, the upper set of the Toms River should be upgraded. But I think it's a lot more than just kind of going waterway by waterway. I just wanted to come back to both the recreational significance definition, but even as importantly, exceptional water supply. Right, that language was in the surface water quality standards for 15 years, but it wasn't until 2003 that you saw some of the state's largest reservoirs be upgraded. And that was the same point that DEP essentially put in a relatively arbitrary cutoff of more than 100,000 people. So that's kind of a reminder that the criteria itself is not set in stone. And in many ways, drinking water is just one of the most kind of powerful reasons, self-interested reasons that we, need to protect waterways. But a truly expansive vision of protecting drinking water isn't just the reservoirs or the tributaries that feed them. It gets at the broader watershed and protecting watershed lands above drinking water intake. Obviously, C1 protections do not have that definition in there right now, but we would advocate that they very much should be more expansive. And obviously, the more the groups and organizations weigh in on that front, the more that hopefully the DEP will be responsive. In terms of the recreational values, this is again, an area where it's a little harder because how do you define that? But certainly, wild and scenic is one provision, but there are other metrics that can be used. And I guess my last thought here too is DEP actually used specifically for the South Branch of the Raritan, used citizen science. In this case, volunteer work done by Raritan Headwaters, which is just a tremendous organization. I have a ton of respect for Bill Kibler and his colleagues, but they have a very documented water monitoring program that they were able to use as a data set that DEP used in the rulemaking process. And so that's kind of a reminder that one or two volunteers doesn't shift doesn't create a data set. But certainly an organization, and there are many watershed groups that do this, can create a data set using the right equipment and the right parameters that state agencies can use for protections.
Thanks.
And I just want to acknowledge Colleen's great question in the chat box. So Colleen Waters, thinking from an environmental justice perspective, have there been instances where protecting these exceptional waters could lead to further impairments to already impaired waters? through discharge diverges to other waters that might not be as protected, for example. Doug, Eric, do you have any initial responses? I have some, but I want to make sure I give you some space to talk too.
I don't
Eric?
know of any, yeah, I don't know of any examples where that has happened. I think typically what happens is a poorly thought out idea doesn't get diverted over to a neighboring watershed so much as it just comes off the drawing board. From the examples that I know of in either HQ or EV streams. Again, HQ streams in Pennsylvania have quite a bit of wiggle room. So oftentimes those developments or those ideas will proceed, but they'll be using some best management practices to minimize the impacts. I have not seen an example where a particular industry or activity or developer looks to a neighboring watershed where there are weaker protections, but it does highlight, and this is, I think, is a great question, Colleen, the value of the C1 upgrade that New Jersey adopted for the Cooper River, right? So that will always be a threat. If we are only preserving, headwater rural areas that are completely forested, it will overall continue to shunt development to areas that are more urbanized and continue to add impacts. So it is something, and as we try to push Pennsylvania DEP to protect unique habitats, not just those that are 100% forested, I think is a good consideration to be thinking about. And the example in New Jersey, I think, is great example. But yeah, I don't know, Abby, if you or Doug have other examples that I have missed.
Yeah, I'll just add that I agree with all of that. And I will note that in Pennsylvania, some of the alternatives that you have to look at are non-discharge alternatives. So you're looking at maybe spray irrigation, other forms of treatment, or even in some cases, a no discharge, right? So is there some way that you can tie into a wastewater treatment plant that can treat successfully the waste instead of just discharging it directly in an HQ or an EV water? And Doug, I'll leave some space for you too.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of reiterate what Eric was saying, this isn't kind of an either or, but the focus of the program traditionally is in more rural parts of the state, right? And so by having more expansive definition on recreational value, and to make sure that we are looking at urban waterways as actual, not just discharge locations to be testing for sensitive species, right? No one a decade ago would say we'd find these mussels in the Cooper. We should expect that urban waterways can have the broad expanse of ecological diversity, and we should ensure that other permitting decisions, like our water treatment plants, for example, should reflect that reality. We should not think of urban waterways as dumping grounds.
I'm afraid it's time to wrap up our session. I want to thank Doug, Abby, and Eric for taking the time to share their knowledge and expertise with us today.